So we're going to shift, we're now going to shift into a full-blown panel. I'm going to invite Andrew, who is absolutely amazing, to lead the next panel, and he's going to introduce his panelists. And Andrew is the CEO of Global Startup Media. We've done some work together, and I'll let him introduce himself. Thank you. And
so my name is Andrew Berkowitz. I am the CEO and founder of Global Startup Media and also the host of the Global Startup Movement podcast. Over the past 2.5 years now, I've had the pleasure to travel all over the world, throughout Africa, Europe, all over, and interview some of the leading figures in the startup and tech ecosystems, and have really spent a lot of time studying all the components that comprise a startup ecosystem, and how can we support some of the incredible entrepreneurs all over the world who are building really unique solutions for the local markets. One of the themes today has been this new generation of young Africans that are coming up, and this generation is going to be a digitally native generation. And what that means is tech entrepreneurship is going to be a super important component to the future of Africa. And Africa needs a local startup ecosystems to support their entrepreneurs. And so with that, I'd like to bring up the panel. We have Akin, Marsha, Seye, and Chris. And so why don't we do quick 30-second intros of who you are and what you do? Seye, you want to start us?
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, my name is Sawyerr Bassir. I started out. Well, I'll tell you what I do right now. I work for an organization like OPIC. It's an investment fund that invests in projects that have a double bottom line. 20% of what we do is investing in funds, including some of those that would then, invest in the things that catalyze, in ventures. A large part of what we do as well in IFU, I represent IFU in West Africa. A large part of what we do is to invest. 70% of what we invest in is greenfields. We're very excited about every single sector. For example, in Ghana, we've invested in aerospace, which isn't something one would ordinarily expect. I also am affiliated with AfriLabs, which is the association. I used to be on the board of AfriLabs, and I'm one of the trustees of AfriLabs. It's an association of a number of hubs in Africa. We've got about 54 members last time I checked, or maybe more now, growing real fast all the time. And I've also been a technology entrepreneur myself and investor.
Thank you. So you were on the same founding board for AfriLabs as my partner, Michael Oluwagbemi, exactly. And the membership now is like 80. Right. Yeah, it's just great. So these are innovation hubs where people are leveraging their understanding of technology to create new businesses. And on the back of that association, for 9 years, I've been part of a group in Nigeria that's been building business accelerators, incubators, and then now accelerators, and local investor networks and local mentoring networks. And so all of the things that the gentlemen have been talking about earlier today have come together in this ecosystem already. And thanks to the election of Buhari in 2015, the anti-corruption platform that was voted in inspired pride in the diaspora with whom I work, and they moved their families back home so that they're full-time residents in Africa again, and hands-on executive directorship for these entities that are growing rapidly. So we've got 40 people on the ground now managing 3 business incubators that have trained hundreds of new businesses. And on top of that, now we are raising capital for a venture fund to invest directly into the businesses that are ready to scale up. probably enough for now. Thanks.
So today I focus primarily on fintech, and within fintech I'm looking at how to deploy blockchain solutions across Africa to solve not just payment problems, but problems across identity management, supply chain, and also education. I grew up in Nigeria, I grew up in Lagos through secondary school, and I moved to the US for college. My first job out of college was with the IMF in Washington, D.C. When I was growing up in Nigeria in the 80s, the two most important institutions were whoever was in power, whichever military dictator was in power, and the IMF. The IMF was one consistent institution you always sort of heard about in terms of what was going on with the economy. And so I was sort of really excited. First job out of college, I had a degree in economics, and it was a very eye-opening experience for me because I realized that, oftentimes the reality is very, very different from the narrative that's often portrayed. But post that, I spent pretty much a long career, 15 years in management consulting, and about 7 years ago, I had the fortune of investing in a mobile payments company in Sierra Leone. We've talked a lot about relationship and the importance of that, and that's sort of what got me into Sierra Leone, because a friend of mine who I went to college with somehow found himself there starting a mobile payments company, and it was in the back of that relationship and trust that we had that I invested in that company, and that began my journey into looking into early stage businesses in Africa. I never moved back. I still live in the United States, but the majority of my work is involved across Africa. So for those who sort of had the question around how can you contribute, I think there are ways you can have a role and play a part that doesn't necessitate actually moving.
I just spoke not too long ago. So.
I think we're good on that.
Yeah, everybody, Chris Foley again here, hi. Mall for Africa, we help US and UK retailers sell products into Africa. Something I didn't mention about me is I also help mentor quite a few individuals and people with startups on the continent. So I'm heavily involved in mentoring and planting that seed that we're all very fortunate and blessed by God to be able to be on this side. So we obviously have our own, I feel, duty to do something back to the continent. And I do that not just financially, but via mentoring, which I think is extremely important.
Awesome. So over the past 6 to 7 years, we've seen an enormous influx of these innovation hubs, these accelerator programs, and just a ton of headlines of early stage startups raising capital. And so I want to open it up to the panel. I mean, what changes in culture, in the local economies, what have been the biggest changes that is driving this increase in startup activity?
I can address that. Some of it is because of the lack of change. And the problem is that the corporations indigenous or endemic to Africa have older people my age on the board of directors and in management positions, and they are not stepping aside to give the young people upward mobility in their careers. And so the young people who are graduating from these fabulous colleges that were spoken of earlier and have amazing world-class talents, degrees, and experience are not able to go home and step into these higher levels of responsibility in corporations. And so they're going back to create their own businesses.
If I may just add to that, I think a lot of that is correct. As one who studied in the US and moved back to Nigeria myself, been back via Europe for 7 years, one of the things that changed, was a lot of people who had been in the US, who had been in Asia, who had been all over the world, had gotten a feel of that startup culture. The whole startup culture is almost an ideology in itself, right? It's a very infectious idea. It's very, very powerful. I mean, I'll give you a real life example. A couple of years ago, Mark Zuckerberg was in Lagos and walking through the streets of Yaba. And this was a billionaire in jeans and t-shirt walking down a major road in Nigeria. He caused quite a stir. A lot of people came out, reached out, and were interested in that. But long before he had come, there had been people like, the guys you mentioned, Michael and Idris with Innovation. There was the likes of CC Hub, with Boston, and quite a number of other people who had gone out and just said, okay, you know what? We don't have to do anything extraordinary. We don't have to be Silicon Valley. We're just going to create a space for people to walk out of. And we're going to tell them about startup culture. And we're going to have entrepreneurs, and sometimes we're just going to take videos of the internet and we're going to show it to these people and tell them how to grow a business or how to code. So it became as simple as just even teaching people how to code. And it's become, as I mentioned, a very, very infectious idea, because all over the country in Nigeria and all over Africa, because what I do, I mean, I travel a lot for work. Every country that I go to, including Africa, I always look for the local hub and go there. I mean, the energy in those places, the energy in the room, the creativity, the striving, that is the Africa that, if you got it to work, would be the Africa that works.
Yeah, I mean, I'll add to that a little bit. I think there have been some fundamental things around just connectivity that has changed or enabled some of the acceleration of startup scene. The mere fact that when I was growing up in Lagos, probably early teenager, there were probably less than 1 million phone lines in Nigeria. I mean, if you could get a dial tone, half the time you were lucky. By the time I got out of college, had my first job, cell phones were beginning to come out. It was really, really expensive. I remember my father was a banker and he got his first cell phone, and it was like some ridiculous amount of money a minute. I'm like, that thing is not worth anything. It's too expensive. But what's happened is, I think as Africa's gotten more connected with the rest of the world, and as connectivity has become more accessible, the flow of information has increased, right? So I can be, in many ways, I think it's empowered individuals to get information, see what is happening across the rest of the world. And with information, with education, you can make the decision to, well, you know what, I can try and do this, right? I think along with that, as Sawyerr kind of mentioned, I think a lot of young people took that plunge to say that we're going to create the ecosystem, right? And when I think about the successful labs across Africa, when I think about the proliferation of labs, I believe the vast majority of them were built, developed, started by Africans who are coming back and who said, we've seen how things work in other economies. There's no reason why it shouldn't happen where we are. And I think many of them in the early days came in, took risks, right? Started something, and it's proliferated. So I think it's just a combination of connectivity and then young people deciding to take and empower themselves.
I'll just add my 2 cents. So I'll look at it from a different view. So I have history with other companies, and then I was trying to start Mall for Africa. I went and I live in the Bay Area, so fortunate for me, I'm, Sand Hill Road, which is where pretty much all the top VCs are. Went to almost all the top VCs, and even with the track record I had, they were unwilling to invest in my idea and unwilling to invest on the continent. And they ended up looking at me saying, one, let me watch my word, stupid VC actually said, do people in Africa know who Ralph Lauren is? Why would they want to buy Ralph Lauren products? And so I just did my pitch to this VC, knowing that I didn't want a dime of their money and they would probably never invest. And another VC was asking about giraffes. That's all he was focused on. I'm like, okay, if that's what you think Africa is, then I'm so shocked you went to such an amazing school and got nothing out of it. But where I'm going with that is, a few years ago, people saw Africa through a different lens. I think they saw Africa as the country with kids with kwashiorkor, flies on their mouths, poverty, people living in huts. And fortunately, things have changed, and people are seeing Africa through a different way. But this was when I was raising my first round about 6 years ago. People didn't see it that way, but we are progressively getting there. One of the major things I think that have shifted is people are now more interested on the continent, and VCs are now paying a little bit more attention. And what I've told people who have tried getting VC funding from mostly the States is, if you put yourself in the shoe of an investor, the investor would never, everybody in this room, you would never invest in exploration on Mars if you have no idea about what exploration on Mars could do. You only invest in stuff you know about, and only put your money into something that you're familiar with. So why would you invest in Africa if you've never been there, if you've never sent anyone there, if you have no clue, like the guy asking me about the giraffe, total idiot. If you have no clue about the continent, then why invest? But I think that shift has taken place, and more people are visiting the continent. They saw Mark Zuckerberg go there. That helped. But we as Africans need to tell our stories a little bit louder, so people can hear us and not think we're laying by some river looking for water.
Well, so Marsha, I guess if that is the reality when it comes to corporates, where the old guard is just holding on, I mean, how do you think we can go about activating more corporate venture capital to enter the space, and then also, I mean, having pilot opportunities with corporates can be a huge game changer for an early stage company. And so what are your thoughts on how we go about activating more corporates to be active in their local startup ecosystems?
Okay, thank you. Can I get back to that after I tell a little story that contextualizes this? 40 years ago, I entertained in my home a Nigerian for Sunday dinner, and he had just arrived in the United States, and it was his first day. And that young man graduated with an engineering degree and is still in the U.S. working as an engineer for the city of Fremont in California. 20 years ago, I was speaking at an African it was actually a global business conference at Wharton School of Business in Pennsylvania, and the keynote speaker for the lunch program was second in command at Credit Suisse First Boston, and he was a Nigerian who had not gone back. But the room was full of Nigerians who were graduating from Wharton School of Business, and they were all talking about their interviews with investment banking firms and what kind of jobs they were looking for on Wall Street. And that gentleman got up and spoke his keynote address. His message was, "I never went back, but you go back." That was his directive. And over the past 20 years, that's what I've seen develop. So what happened, for example, things that have happened, there have been the networks that have grown of African diaspora networks, like where I met Toyin a couple years ago. And she was just so amazed that such a thing existed. But I started getting involved with them probably 15 years ago. And the Kenyans were networking, and it was just for this purpose, is the entrepreneurship. They all had ideas about businesses they'd like to launch, and they would pitch those, but they had no idea how to make that a reality. So they needed the mentoring and the venture capital. But if you look at Silicon Valley as a case study of cultures that have gone through the same stages, the Indians and the Chinese came to top universities and engineering schools, primarily given the Silicon Valley context. And then when they graduated, they were asked to be part of the venture teams that then grew. They were venture capital backed by the Sandhill people, investors, and then they grew the businesses and then became profitable and then exited those businesses, usually to an IPO back in those days. And so they're sitting there with this capital that from a venture that had been successful, and they looked at each other and they thought, we'll just go home and do the same thing. It'll cost less to hire people, and they've got big markets, and our overhead will be lower. And lo and behold, the venture capital followed them. Usually it was from their own diaspora, their own indigenous investors backed them when they came home. And now what has happened over these years is the same thing is happening with African diaspora. In 2008, when the global meltdown happened, Nigerians looked at each other and thought, well, I lost my job here, but I can, Wall Street just kind of, but I could go back to Africa and do something really exciting, really impactful, and without much competition. And so that was one thing that happened. Another was that because the currency value became so low relative to the strength of the dollar, it cost a whole lot more for Nigerians to send their youth away to top colleges. So they stayed home and realized, wow, I can get a pretty good education here. And if I want to go to graduate school, I can do that. So all of these things have worked together to create more of a tipping point where the caliber of people and the number of people and the networks of the people are all working together so that some of the astute Africans are launching their own businesses, and others, their friends, are launching venture capital funds so that they can invest in their friends. And the networks that have that confirm high level of integrity, such as the Harambean Entrepreneurs Alliance, are looked to as vetting agencies for potential venture capital investments, because those networks are geared toward Africans encouraging each other to be all they can be and to be the best they can be and to work together to help each other achieve successes, and then they all that will raise all ships. Instead of the competitive infighting and hurting of each other, it's a mutual lifting up. So all of these things are coming together simultaneously. So yes, I'm trying to raise a venture capital fund, and we're trying to figure out how to do it for this niche. And it's taking a lot of work and a lot of no's and a lot of discouragement. And you realize that it really is the fact that most people haven't spent 40 years getting to know Africans like I have. And so how do I leapfrog over that? How do you build trust fast enough and you're exactly right. Travel is a big part of it. We're going to have investor trips. Our incubator in Lagos hosted a group that came in. It was anyway, that came in from all over, Botswana, Australia, Switzerland, that sort of thing. And then we had our top people pitch to them, and now, but it's just, it's a process that we're all going through. But right now, there are a lot of absolutely amazing diaspora, African, well, I say diaspora, but they're going back and forth between the continent and Europe, between the U.S. and the continent. And they are trying to raise capital, but for them, $1 million or maybe the most $5 million is about all that they're able to get this year. The last 2 years this has been going on. But they will show that what they can do. In our case, our pilot portfolio, we invested 14 times into 10 companies, and half those companies aren't doing so well, half are doing just fine, and 2 are really stellar growth things that have created over 1,000 jobs and have given us a 10x, not return, but appreciated value on our investment. In other words, so like $5,000 here, here, up to maybe $20,000 there. It's been like $200,000. Is now worth $2 million. And some of the names are well known to those of you who track these things. Undella and Flutterwave are two big winners. And they've still got a long way to go. So they've already attracted over $100 million in follow-on private sector capital. None of this is charity, none of it's donations. Yes, the profits are going back into building the company, as all good growth companies do at this stage. But there's some very exciting stories, and we are finally getting our unicorn stories, so that stimulates more investment as well.
Can I pick it up from the point about the unicorns? Because that also signals a huge other dimension to this thing, right? There's to the whole startup culture and technology, all the growth that there is in investment into technology. So Nigeria now has this company called there's InterSwitch. There's a company called InterSwitch, right? Which everybody thinks might be the first billion-dollar valuation Nigerian company. And there's people are waiting and watching for that to happen. InterSwitch didn't come out of any of the hubs. There are many other technology companies that have become, in fact, the biggest didn't come from the hubs. One of the things that actually drove technology early on in the early 90s in Nigeria, long before the telecoms boom came, was the fact that the banks, there was explosive growth in the banks. There was a bit of liberalization in the banking sector, and the banks needed software, and generally couldn't get proper support from IBMs and the top companies. And so a lot of people started building that software, and that's where you saw the likes of JKK, the likes of so many of those other companies, and that's where everything came out of. So the point I'm making is a lot of it comes from that return, from that global startup culture, but a lot of it is also African. A lot of it is also being driven by local need, by the fact that people are genuinely entrepreneurial and looking for tools that help them to enable business, whatever it is they're trying to do. And then came the telecom story. So if you take a country like Nigeria, but that's also true for South Africa. It's also true for Ghana. It's also true for Kenya. It's also true for all of the major African economies. What has been happening is that telecoms and TMT is one of the biggest sources of FDI into those countries. It's billions of dollars of investments every year just to maintain your network, and then to keep expanding it and that level of growth creates a huge ecosystem of people who are into software, who are into software testing, who are into systems engineering and all kinds of things. And all of that is another powerful demonstration story that allows people to see that you can just take what seems like putting 20 people in a room, giving them computers, and achieving extraordinary growth and value, which is a very, very important point to make, because when people have thought about Africa and all of the African countries, and one of the things generally I have a problem with the word Africa. It's 54 countries, it's so many different groupings, and East Africa is very different from North Africa and so on and so forth. But this is true about all of Africa, which is that we think about it in extractive terms. Oil, mining, agriculture, in natural resource terms. Very few people think about it in terms of creating value, from higher or more complexity activities. And the fact that all of this is starting to happen, I think really all goes well. And then the question you'd asked about, was it a question about getting corporate funding, or was it a question about VCs?
It was a question of activating more corporates to, one, create venture arms, but also to be more open-minded and more active in entering into pilot contracts with local companies, local startups?
So that's beyond my pay grade.
Well, so, and this is a theme that we hear over and over again. Africa is, it's not a country, it's a set of diverse countries with different cultures, and that market fragmentation actually presents somewhat of a challenge to entrepreneurs. It's the same thing in Europe, it's the same thing in Southeast Asia, where in the US or China, you start a company and you have this one large homogenous market that you can attack. Whereas, in Africa, you win a market that's not necessarily big enough to, go from a seed round to a larger growth round. So Chris, I would love to hear from you, because you took your company from a small startup in Nigeria to a scale up across 15 different countries in Africa. So going through that experience, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges in, we see all these headlines of seed rounds, but getting to that Series A, Series B round, what are some of the biggest challenges you think African startups face with that hitting that growth stage?
That's a good question. I think it really goes back to the VC and trying to find a VC that has actually worked on the continent and understands the continent, because there will be challenges. With Africa, you don't have plan A and plan B. You have plan A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K. And you probably, by the time you're really out there, you probably be doing stuff that you didn't even know. I mean, I told you about gummy bears. I mean, I can't believe I'm shipping gummy bears. What the heck? That's not why I started this company, to ship gummy bears. I didn't do that. But that's what I'm shipping. I'm shipping gummy bears. I'm shipping toilet paper. I'm like, what the heck, But hey, that's what they want. That's what we ship, So you have to have all of these. I think you have to have all of these plans in place. You have to have a VC that has worked on the continent. Our VC is the same VC as IntoSwitch, which is a company called Helios. Two Nigerian guys started an African fund, a 3.8 billion African fund. They're focused on Africa. They understand the continent. They know that you do have to go through the entire alphabet to figure out what you're going to end up doing. So I do think finding the right VC that understands that the market's challenging, there are going to be dips and turns, ups and downs. That's the biggest challenge. It's not really the idea or the people and the tenacity that people have. I think it's more of the VC world trying to understand more about the continent and what the continent has to offer, and people to know that it's definitely not going to be easy. Going back to your previous question, there is a platform called Geeks on a Plane. I'm not sure if anybody in here has heard of it, but Geeks on a Plane is an amazing way for entrepreneurs, not entrepreneurs, investors. So if there are any investors in the room, sign up for Geeks on a Plane, because it's investors. You put you on an airplane, or they schedule your flights. You go from country to country to country to country, meeting with entrepreneurs with brilliant ideas. They pitch to you. You can fund them, or you can find out more information about them. But another thing that's doing is it's opening up the continent and getting investors interested in the continent and interested in people and their ideas locally, instead of this, fearful mindset of, Africa cannot support my business and all that blah, blah, blah.
So this is a panel on startups innovation, so I would be remiss if I didn't bring up the B word. And so, Akin, how can blockchain impact the way money and value moves around Africa? And what are your thoughts on the practical use cases for African markets?
So I'll give a little bit of context. So, I mentioned 7 years ago I invested in a mobile payments company in Sierra Leone, and it was, in many ways, shortly after starting the company, we were thinking about, when you think about payments, you look for volume, right? And if you look at Sierra Leone as a country, it was post-conflict, very, very small consumer market, and the majority of volume in the system was absorbed by the electric company, but mostly development agencies that were spending money into the country. And we learned very, very quickly that development agencies could bring money into the country and land it at a bank, but then how do I get that pot of money to 10,000 individuals in a country where you had 24 bank branches across the whole country? There was no infrastructure, right? And so, we decided to essentially build a payment network, an agent network, to facilitate not just payments for DFIs, but also an easy and convenient way for individuals to make payments. Now, in order to do that successfully, we had to do everything from creating individual identities for users, because if you don't have an identity, then how do I know who's getting paid, who's being tracked? So even though the country only had about a 30% mobile penetration rate, and literacy levels, literacy level for adults is only about 38%. So the majority of the country doesn't have phones and is illiterate, and that's our customer base, right? So in many ways, we had to basically design a system where we were our own identity platform. Everyone had a SIM card, even though they didn't have a phone, because we tied identities to SIM cards. So literally, when we launched, individuals would show up at an agent with a SIM card. And that SIM card gets inserted into an agent's phone. He does a transaction, and voila, they paid for something. But the other thing we also realized very quickly was that in many countries, particularly at the bottom of the pyramid, if you look across sub-Saharan Africa, about half of the income for many families comes from abroad, remittances. And when we looked at a remittance market, for example, look at Nigeria. Nigeria gets, in my view, about $40 billion a year in remittances. World Bank figure says about 22 billion. But there are a lot of informal ways that money comes in that can't really be tracked by financial systems. So it's somewhere between 20 and 40 billion, right? And sub-Saharan Africa is still the most expensive corridor in the world for remittances, right? So about 10% of all the money that goes in is absorbed by middlemen in fees, which from a technical standpoint is pretty ridiculous, because you have platforms today that can remit money in seconds for almost nothing, right? So the problem is something else, right? And so for me, blockchain was sort of a solution. It's almost like it's a solution that showed up that we wish we had 10 years ago, because it would have made it easy to solve all the problems we had to solve in establishing a mobile payments company, right? And so in many ways, when you look at the challenge across Africa, it starts with very, very fundamental things that I think people always think about. Everyone in America has a form of identity that's government issued, right? A driver's license, a social security number. You have something that identifies you across the system, across the financial system, across your behavior and activity. Most Africans don't have that. And those that do have dumb IDs, right? They don't really, there's no digital back end that is able to travel. So if I can't document my information, if I can't prove who I am, it's pretty hard to transact, right? The cost of transactions goes up exponentially. So I think fundamentally, blockchain can solve some of those issues around identity, around being able to create digital systems that allows information to move back and forth that people have visibility into. So we talked about supply chains in some of the previous panels. It's important to know that I can track an identity, I can track payments, I can track legal documents in a system that cannot be manipulated. Because oftentimes when you talk to people about Africa, oftentimes questions come around, well, how do I know I can trust the information, right? Who's the information coming from, right? And I think we need databases, we need systems that we can, say, look, the information is secure, the information is accurate, and the information cannot be manipulated. And that means digitizing systems, right? I think that becomes just the fundamental base through which you can now build payment systems, right? You can interconnect countries, right? So there's no use having a free trade agreement if I can't trade. If I can't get your currency to transfer, if I cannot translate Naira to CFA easily, if it's too expensive, how am I going to trade, right? So you need systems that can allow you to digitally take advantage of digital platforms to make it easier to transact, easier to identify yourself, and to create visibility into information systems.
So Marsha, with this new fund you're raising, I would be curious to hear what are some of the common objections or hesitations that you're seeing from LPs in the meetings that you're having.
Okay, thank you. Can I answer your last question?
Yeah, absolutely.
I forgot to go back and do it the last time. Okay, so you asked about how corporates are getting involved in helping with VC, and let me just give the background. In 1997, I helped with a corporate joint venture between a U.S. extractive company and Sucor in South Africa. There she woke up. Hi. So as part of that joint venture, 10% of all of the top-line revenues that we generated were put aside into an upstream training trust. She's nodding. And that went largely into bursaries to provide scholarships for the labor pool that would then support the industry that we were focused on. And I just thought that was brilliant. So that was one way to, everybody wins, right? Fast forward now 20-some years. Of course, MTN is the big telecom, and you see their distribution on every corner. And all of these years, I've looked at Coca-Cola and thought, why can't people leverage that distribution network and just add one more product? And MTN, fortunately, has opened their distribution centers outlets to be able to do that. And one of these companies that is a solar panel connected to, charge up your phone, Phoenix, won a partnership agreement with them, and so they were able to immediately ramp up and raise $20 million and distribute everywhere and leverage the distribution network that MTN already had to get these panels out there. And of course, there again, it's a win-win situation because people use their phones more because they don't run out of batteries. They don't have to keep going and getting them recharged. So those are some of the ways that I've seen. Then further, Orange Ventures just launched their own venture capital fund last year, set up an office in Côte d'Ivoire. And I talked to them before they set it up, and I said, well, would you invest in our fund? And they said, no, but we want your deal flow, which is a common theme that I'm getting. In other words, we've got to figure out a way to invest in the startups and get them to the Series B and C level before the corporate VCs will come in. But that still gives my investors hope of an exit in a fairly short time period. So I'll go with that. Safaricom is also a great generator of ventures for VCs to invest in, and they've backed a fund similar to ours in East Africa.
And I saw that they also opened up an M-Pesa API to the public as well.
Yes,
So
that's right. That's right. You might explain that a little more. But just to top it off, VMware, does anybody know what VMware is or does? Oh, right. I didn't. When I got off the podium at the Africa Diaspora Network in January in Silicon Valley, and this guy comes up, he's from Nigeria, and he hands me his card. He said, I'm from VMware. And I'm thinking, oh boy. And he said, we do the infrastructure for cloud computing. I thought, oh, okay, got it. And he said that he'd been given basically a blank check by his corporate leadership to train African technology people in how to build cloud infrastructure. And I said, well, that's wonderful. And he said, but I've been here so long, I don't know how to connect with African techies. Can you help me? And I'm thinking, yeah, AfriLabs. So I introduced him to Anna, and she immediately, jumped on that, and he jumped on that. And so we're going to have this network that you set up, thankfully, leveraging corporate venture in sort of, what would that be? It's sort of a foundation building. So then you're going to have an entire generation that is going to be capable of the cloud computing infrastructure serving that need for Africa. Yes. Oh, what was your question again?
Well, so one thing that came to mind while you're giving that answer, I've heard challenges on both sides of entrepreneurs trying to find capital, but VCs trying to find quality deal flow, right? So I'll kind of open that up to the panel. I mean, right now, which do you think is a bigger challenge in the Africa tech ecosystems? Is it entrepreneurs trying to find that seed Series A round, or is it VCs trying to find high quality deal flow for their funds?
I think there's a more fundamental problem than that. I think part of the problem is Africans are looking to the wrong pools of money. So for me, I think what would be more useful to do is to galvanize local high net worth individuals, corporates, look for local money, and educate them as to what global startup investing looks like, right? So there are associations like, Nigeria, the Lagos Angel Network, the African Business Angel Network. They're spending a lot of time trying to galvanize local money. But to your question too, I think another really untapped pool is the diaspora. I mean, I just talked about $40 billion moving to Nigeria this year. That's a lot of money. And it's not all going to paying for school fees or just to keep the lights on. It's going into investments, right? And, after the Africa Diaspora Network in 2016, I ran a small survey amongst just my network. And I asked about 50 people, would you invest in Africa? If yes, how much are you willing to invest annually? And from responses from 50 people, just within a short survey, I had at least $500,000 that said, I want to invest in early stage tech in Africa, right? And these are Africans who understand those markets. So there's less of a education gap you have to go through. I think the challenge is it's quite disaggregated, and there needs to be some organization and some structure around how you pool those funds to invest back home. And the other thing I also realized too is people are also emotional investors, right? It's not always just about a return. It's, I have an affinity for where I come from and I want to do something. I'm not gonna move back. Not everyone is gonna move back, right? But the people that have income, have assets, and want to invest. And I think primarily that's more important, because if you can convince local money to invest, if you convince the diaspora to invest, then invariably you'll get their friends, right? You'll get people that say, it's like when you go into a new country for the first time and you want to figure out where you want to eat, I look to where the locals are eating, because that to me is an authentic experience, right? And if I'm a foreigner wanting to invest in Africa, the first thing I'll probably think about is, well, who are the Africans I know? Are they investing? What are they investing in? And if I don't see enough of local smart money investing, oftentimes it's like, well, I don't necessarily want to be the dumb money. And if they're not investing, why should I? So I think it's really more important to figure out ways we can better organize and galvanize our own sources of funding, however small. And even for a lot of your early stage companies, I'm sure you've invested in, a lot of the early money was local money, right? It was local money saying, I understand that problem intimately. I understand the market. I'm willing to take that risk because I have a lot of information that de-risks it. And then you can kind of build a pipeline that way. So I think there's a lot of lower hanging fruit. And I think the other point too I wanted to make around the wrong source of money is I've seen many cases across Africa where foreign money is investing in things that will not work in Africa because they're not solving local African problems, right? And oftentimes it doesn't really make sense to me because you're losing in two ways. You're losing because you're deploying capital in the wrong things, but on top of that, you're taking African talent to solve problems that don't need solving, right? So talent is focused on the wrong things. And I see a few ecosystems across Africa where it's dominated by foreign money that's not solving African problems and really isn't going to build things to scale. So there's this perversion in the system that's beginning to happen in some areas. And I think there needs to be sort of, right, moving away from that and getting more alignment across the whole chain of what are we solving, where's the money coming from, and is there philosophical alignment around an intimate understanding of that problem that you're trying to back.
So Seye, you were kind of
Okay.
Yeah.
shaking your head on that
Yeah,
one.
I'll start off where Akin left off, which is I had a very similar experience on this trip. On this trip to the US, I've been here about 10 days, and I was at a funeral, and at some point I brought up something I was investing in, and then I had 4 people signing up to invest in it. So there's quite a huge interest in people in the diaspora trying to invest back in Africa. And in, I'll just talk about why it's so difficult to raise capital. And again, I'll start out where Akin left off. If you can mobilize local capital, why it's so important is that it actually gives a lot of credibility to the ecosystem. And it also ensures against the problem of investing in the wrong things. And I'll illustrate what I mean. What has happened in a lot of the hubs, that I see in, across AfriLabs, across Africa, a lot of them, the only money they can get, the only funding they can get is funding from donor agencies, essentially. And what that has created is a lot of them have now focused in on things like social innovation, which is very, very valuable and very important, right? But and maybe even more important than the economic stuff, right? But there isn't enough of a focus on solving the hardcore technology problems, the venture problems that the continent needs to solve. And it's more of a problem when the biggest hubs are the ones focused on that, because that then becomes a pattern for the whole ecosystem, and the ecosystem starts to be built around a donor agenda. The donor agenda is very, very important. It cannot be done away with, but it's external, right? It's and basically it's top down. It's not from the bottom up, and from the billion bottoms up. So investing in VC funds is very, very difficult. As Chris said, in Africa you don't have plan A or B, right? Actually, it's that you're somebody's plan Z. And so what that means, as someone who invests in funds, right, in vehicles that are raising capital and structuring to invest all over Africa, we encounter a lot of VC funds. And the real challenge we have is that a lot of the people, I say to a certain extent that I understand the space, but a lot of people do not understand the space. They just simply do not. They're used to and another problem is that a lot of the organizations that actually have the capital and can invest it are organizations like IFU, who are development finance institutions. And so what experience do we have? What experience do DFIs have? They have experience investing in power plants, in roads, in agribusiness, and hard things. They have no idea about how to even value an asset. So you come to them with a proposition. We're stuck for the next 3 months discussing how are we going to value this. And so that's one big problem. And so it goes back to that point about local capital and local pools of capital. One tragedy that is happening, and maybe tragedy is a hard word, but something that is going very wrong in Africa is that pension funds have a lot of money, a whole lot of money, probably hundreds of billions of dollars. And if structured properly and looked at on a portfolio perspective, you could probably raise a couple of billions of dollars to invest in VC funds, to go after that VC technology space. But they don't understand it either. They don't understand it either. So it then goes back to that early stage money, right? That initial group of people who go back, the initial group of people who just take those risks. It's going to be very important to have those unicorns who list as IPOs, right? That the general public can see that this was created from a startup environment and then became this huge corporate behemoth that people can relate with. So it's going to take time. But I'm going to lean towards saying, going back to your question, which is, I would lean towards saying the difficulty is quality startups. It always is. There's more than excess capital. There's extraordinary levels of capital. I've recently discovered loads of VC funds in Asia, from recent trips to Asia, who are just looking at it and thinking, that looks very interesting, but we don't have the slightest clue. How do we even get there, right? And unlike the US or the UK or Europe, where Rwandans and Nigerians and Kenyans have been to study and gone back, that's not necessarily the case in Asia, right? And so that nexus isn't there. That link back isn't necessarily there. So, I mean, overall, I think it's a growth story. It will continue to be a growth story. There's going to be a lot of need to get policy to understand what needs to happen domestically to mobilize that domestic capital and get it into risky things. One of the major issues you have in Africa, it's not just for the VC space, it's that a lot of businesses who are starting out in Africa are looking to banks to raise money. And anybody who's been a banker here or who's ever approached a bank for a loan to start a business knows that's not where you go to raise money. It's just no way. But that's the only organized pool of capital that there is, right, in Africa. And so there's a lot of work to do also in building up the financial ecosystem and having all that innovation in it and getting the policy to start moving some of that pension money. Because the pension money, I'm looking at it there, yes, it's money that should be safe, but the truth of the matter is if the average age in Africa is 30 years old, right, or the median age or something like that is 30 years old, or even less in some countries, that means the pension money is not going to be touched for 30, 35 years. You can make riskier investments on balance, and in any case, 1% or 0.1% portfolio allocation to VCs, to proper VCs, not just for the digital space, but also for the rest of the economy, is going to go a long way, and it's going to catalyze a lot. I mean, we all know that's how it's done everywhere else, right? That's what moves it.
Yep, and so I think that's all we have time for, but I mean, I hope we inspired you all to maybe think about, even a $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 angel check could be a game changer for an early stage company in Africa. But let's give it up for the panel. One last tidbit.
So a quick summary is to look at the funding food chain, and you can imagine that some entrepreneurs only need the small amounts, but others need the big amounts. And like we heard earlier today, there's no trouble of enough money. But the problem is breaking the money into smaller chunks. It's easier to put it into big chunks and big projects, and that's where it's been going. Now what happens then, though, is that money doesn't find enough big companies to go into, so it sits there and doesn't get invested and doesn't make returns, and so those investors aren't happy. So I can go on this, but you get the picture. Thank you.